On a sticky July night in 1979 in a cramped government bungalow in New Delhi, a 76-year-old man sat hunched over a wooden desk surrounded by files thicker than bricks. In 48 hours, he had to prove a majority on the floor of Parliament or fall. Outside, the city hummed with rumors that his government wouldn't last a week, that his coalition would shatter before the ink dried. That he was just a stopgap, a footnote in the story owned by one powerful family. And somewhere across the city, in her own residence, sat his greatest rival, Indira Gandhi, the woman whose shadow had loomed over Indian politics for more than a decade. She wasn't prime minister anymore. But every defection, every whisper, every wavering MP still seemed to bend in her direction. He shuffled another list of numbers, murmuring to himself, 270, 271, if he doesn't cross the floor, if she doesn't change her mind. 76 years old, 2 days to secure a majority, a lifetime spent fighting for farmers' land and dignity, now boiled down to a simple, brutal math, survive or be erased. The clock was ticking, and in that suffocating room as the fan creaked overhead and the telephone refused to ring with promised support, the boy from a dusty village in western Uttar Pradesh, the son of a poor peasant, faced the same enemy he had always faced, power concentrated in the hands of a few against the will of the many. That man was Charan Singh. To understand what brought him to that desperate night, to understand why he was willing to risk humiliation on the national stage rather than bow, we have to travel back more than 7 decades to a time when India was not yet free and a thin child in a rough cotton kurta walked barefoot between fields his family did not truly own, because Charan Singh's story does not begin in Parliament. It begins in the dust. He was born on 23rd of December 1902 in a tiny village called Nurpur in the Meerut district of what is now Uttar Pradesh. The British called the region United Provinces. For the people who lived there, it might as well have been called United Debts. Imagine the landscape. Endless flat fields of wheat and sugarcane sliced by narrow mud paths and irrigation channels. Bulls plowing land that had been plowed for generations, each furrow soaked not just in sweat but in fear of the moneylender. As ledger of the landlord's agent, of the tax collector's knock on the door, Charan Singh's father, a small jat farmer, tilled a modest patch of land. It was enough to keep the family alive but never far from the edge. A bad monsoon, an illness, one failed harvest, and everything could be swallowed by debt. The young boy watched men older than his father stand before the village moneylender with hands folded, ready to sign away the next 10 years of their crop just to survive the next 10 days. The British legal documents were in English and Persian, thick with words no peasant could read. One thumbprint on a piece of paper could mean generations of bondage. The ink was black. The consequences were blood red. For most children in the village, this was simply the way the world worked. But Charan was not most children. He was quiet, observant, the kind of boy who said little but remembered everything. At night, under a smoky lantern, he would listen to his father and other farmers discuss how much of their harvest would vanish as rent and interest. He saw their rough hands, cracked by labor, tremble while counting coins they never seemed to keep. A question took root in him like a stubborn weed. Why? Why should the man who works the land be the last to eat from it? There was one advantage Charan had that many of his neighbors didn't. His father insisted he go to school. In an age when many village boys stopped at basic literacy, if that, Charan walked miles to a small school, his slate tucked under. His arm, his stomach often half empty, but his mind fully alert. He excelled. Numbers came easily. Words became weapons in his hands. Where his father saw a terrifying legal deed, Charan saw a pattern, something that could be read, broken down, rewritten. In the district town of Meerut, where he later studied in high school, he saw a different India. Lawyers in starched coats, British. Officers on horseback, clerks who could, with a single stroke of their pen, decide the fate of entire villages. The contrast hit him like a slap. In the countryside, a farmer could work 16 hours a day and still lose his home for a small unpaid loan. In town, a man with clean hands and the right papers could own land he'd never even seen. That injustice hardened something inside him. When Charan Singh went to Agra to continue his studies, first a degree in science, then a law degree, he was no longer just a bright student eager to escape poverty. He was a young man quietly sharpening a blade, The British court system, with its rigid procedures and alien language, had been designed to control, but Charan looked at it and thought, if this is the tool they use to crush us, then I will learn to wield it better than they do. That was his first twist. Instead of rejecting the foreign system outright, he walked into its heart, determined to bend it to the service of the people his rulers despised. By the late 1920s, with his law degree in hand, Charan Singh began practicing as a lawyer in Ghaziabad and Meerut. Compared to his village roots, it was a different universe. He could have chosen the path many bright young men did, build a lucrative practice, curry favor with senior British-trained lawyers, dine at clubs where peasants were talked about like statistics, not human beings. But look at the clients who started to fill his cramped office. Not wealthy merchants, not big landlords, but men who still smelled of the earth. Farmers with red turbans and coarse dhotis, clutching crumpled documents and eviction notices. Widows who had been cheated out of ancestral land by cunning relatives. Debt-burdened families whose interest had silently grown larger than the loan itself. Charan didn't just see cases. He saw patterns. Over and over, the same story. Ignorance of the law being turned into a weapon against the poor. He would sit with them for hours, translating dense legal phrases into simple language, tracing each clause with his finger. Here, this is where they trapped you. Here, this is how we will fight back. The courtroom became his first battlefield. But outside those walls, a larger storm was brewing. In 1929, a name began to echo even in small towns of the United Provinces with a force that the British could no longer ignore. Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi. Gandhi's call for civil disobedience, for salt satyagraha, for boycotts, for a rejection of British authority, was sweeping across India like a second monsoon, this one made of slogans and spinning wheels and a fierce, ridiculous hope. Charan was 27, young enough to be swept away, old enough to understand the risk. For a lawyer building his reputation, joining the Indian National Congress and openly defying the colonial government was not a career move. It was a declaration of war. But when Gandhi spoke of India's villages as the soul of the nation and of the peasant as its spine, Charan felt as if someone had finally said out loud what he had quietly believed since childhood. Freedom for him was not a flag. It was a ledger wiped clean. He joined the Congress in 1929. Within a year, he was marching in protests, participating in Gandhi's civil disobedience movement, tearing down the illusion of British legitimacy not with violence but with refusal. Refusal to pay unjust taxes. Refusal to obey unjust laws. Refusal to accept that the farmer was born to be exploited. The British responded the way empires always respond to disobedience, with prison. Charan Singh was arrested, his budding legal career suddenly interrupted by the cold reality of a colonial jail cell. The iron bars, the stench, the endless days of confinement, they were meant to break him. Instead, they clarified his purpose. He shared that suffocating space with peasants, political prisoners, students, men who had left everything behind for a dream. At night, as they traded stories and whispers, Charan realized something painful. Winning a case in court could save one family. Changing the law could save millions. When provincial elections were announced in 1937 under the Government of India Act, the political map of the United Provinces began to shift. For the first time, Indians would form ministries in the provinces, even if final power still lay with the British. Congress needed candidates who understood villages, who could speak to the masses with credibility. Charan Singh didn't look like the typical politician of that time. He wasn't from a grand aristocratic family. He had no personal army of tenants and laborers to swing votes, no vast estates, no British titles. What he had was far more dangerous to the old order, the trust of the peasantry. He contested from Chaprauli, a rural constituency in western UP. The campaign trails were mud roads and bullock carts. The meeting halls were banyan trees and school verandas. He would stand before crowds of sunburnt faces and talk not of abstract nationalism, but of the price of grain, the cruelty of compound interest, the tyranny of the moneylender. He told them, "Your votes are not charity. They are weapons. Use them to change the laws that chain you." They listened. He won. At 35, Charan Singh entered the United Provinces Legislative Assembly. The quiet boy from Nagpur was now a lawmaker. But the question he had asked as a child, why should the man who works the land be the last to eat from it, still burned unanswered. Now, for the first time, he had a chance to do something about it. Inside the assembly, he found a world of polished speeches, backroom deals, and a strange discomfort with the people who actually produced food. Yes, many Congress leaders spoke passionately about independence. But when discussions turned to land, to debt, to how much power landlords should keep in a free India, the room grew tense. There were powerful interests in that chamber. Big zamindars, moneyed men who had funded the movement, politicians who owed their influence to the very structures that squeezed the farmers dry. Charan Singh walked in carrying not just files but the anger of generations. In 1939, he helped draft and push through one of his earliest and most important pieces of legislation, the United Provinces Debt Redemption Bill. On paper, it was just a law about agricultural debt. In reality, it was a small revolution. It limited the interest that could be charged on loans to peasants. It gave them a legal route out of the black hole of compound interest. It recognized, maybe for the first time on such a scale, that the farmer was not a bottomless well of exploitation, but a citizen with rights. For village moneylenders, it was an earthquake. For peasants who had pawned their wives' jewelry, their children's future, their very bodies to the debt trap, it was a first breath of air. But laws do not pass without enemies. Whispers began. This young man is going too far. He is unsettling the landed classes. He is dangerous. That was Charan Singh's second twist. Instead of rising in politics by making peace with power, he began rising by attacking it. He was no longer just challenging British rule. He was challenging the Indian elite who were preparing to inherit it. Then came 1942. The Quit India movement exploded across the country, and whatever illusions remained about a gentle negotiation with the British began to burn. Charan Singh threw himself into the movement. Protests, underground meetings, secret distribution of pamphlets. He was now not only a legislator but a rebel. The British had tolerated a young lawyer's defiance. They were less indulgent toward a sitting member of the assembly who openly demanded that they quit India. Arrest followed again. This time, when the prison gates closed behind him, the stakes were higher. The war raged across the globe. Uncertainty dripped from every newspaper headline. Inside the jail, the conversations took on a new urgency. Not just how to throw the British out, but what would replace them. Would independent India simply exchange white sahibs for brown ones? Would the peasant finally stand upright or still bend his back under a new master? For Charan Singh, the answer was non-negotiable. Freedom without justice for the farmer would be a hollow victory. He walked out of prison after his release not as the same man who had gone in, but as someone carrying a blueprint in his head. A plan to tear down the feudal structure that had imprisoned his people long before any British jail ever did. And even as the tricolor was being stitched in cities, he was already thinking about the next war, against zamindari, against feudal land ownership, against the quiet tyranny of tradition. Independence was coming. But for the man who would one day be called the champion of India's peasants, the real battle had only just begun. On the night of 15th of August 1947, as fireworks cracked over Delhi and Nehru's voice floated on the radio, at the stroke of the midnight hour, a very different sound rose from the villages of western Uttar Pradesh. Silence. No drums, no flags. Just the dull thud of bare feet on hard earth as farmers walked back from fields they still did not own. The rulers had changed. The land had not. In a cramped room lit by a kerosene lamp, Charan Singh sat cross-legged on the floor, a copy of the freshly printed Indian Independence Act and a pile of British tenancy laws spread before him. On the radio, they spoke of freedom. On the paper, he saw chains that had not yet been broken. He ran his finger under a clause on proprietary rights, under another on compensation, and felt a chill. If the new India simply respected all existing rights of big landlords, if it paid them lavish compensation for giving up estates, and if it kept the fine print of colonial property law intact, then what would really change for the peasant who slept tonight on someone else's soil? The clock of history had struck midnight. But for the man from Nurpur, a different clock had started ticking. How long did he have before the ink of independence dried into a new, permanent injustice? In the first ministry of the United Provinces after independence, Charan Singh was no longer just an opposition voice. Under Chief Minister Govind Ballabh Pant, he became part of the government, first as a parliamentary secretary, soon as a minister. handling crucial departments connected to law, information, and above all, land. To many ambitious congressmen, this was the moment to settle in, to enjoy power after decades of struggle. To him, it was the narrowest of windows. The peasants' cause had powerful enemies, zamindars with mansions in Lucknow and Allahabad, lawyers who had grown rich defending them, Congress leaders whose electoral strength still depended on those feudal networks. If land reform was not pushed through quickly, before the new constitution hardened property rights, before the landlords regrouped, the revolution would be strangled in its cradle. He would sit late into the night with files sprawled around him, scratching notes in the margins of draft bills, muttering calculations under his breath. How much compensation can the state afford? How much land must a landlord be allowed to keep? What happens to the sharecropper when his master disappears? There was no manual for what he was trying to do. No colony had ever attempted to dismantle centuries of feudalism through law while still pretending to be polite about it. The battle crystallized in one document that would become the spine of his legacy, the bill to abolish zamindari in Uttar Pradesh. On the surface, it was a technical piece of legislation. P. Zamindari Abolition and Land Reforms Bill. Inside, it was dynamite. It proposed to uproot the class of intermediaries who sat between the state and the actual tiller, the big landlords who collected rent-controlled water, decided who could live in which hut, whose shadow could fall on which well. If passed and implemented as Charan Singh wanted, millions of tenants would become owners. The invisible wall between Malik and Mazdur would crack. The opposition was immediate, furious, and at times elegant. In the assembly, zamindar members rose in white silk and gold-bordered shawls to defend tradition. They spoke in polished Urdu and English of social harmony, of respect for property, of gradual change. Outside, their men whispered threats in village courtyards. If this law passes, there will be no jobs, no loans, your protector will be gone. Who will you turn to then? Charan answered them not with slogans, but with arithmetic. He stood in the assembly, a thin figure in a simple dhoti kurta, and laid out the numbers. How many years has the tenant paid rent? How many times over has the landlord recovered the cost of the land? How much more blood must be squeezed out before we admit the debt has been repaid? It was not simply a speech. It was an indictment stretching back centuries. But speeches alone could not move such a mountain. Behind the scenes, in suffocating committee rooms, a slower, more dangerous war was being fought. Line by line, clause by clause, landlord lobbies tried to insert words that would allow endless litigation, subject to appeal, except in special circumstances. Every except, every subject to, was a trap that could swallow a peasantess lifetime. Charan would circle those phrases in red pencil, slam his palm on the table, and say in a low, tight voice, "You are not drafting a law. You are drafting an escape route." His own colleagues in the Congress, some of them heroes of the freedom struggle, urged moderation. Why antagonize the big landholders so quickly? Why not delay implementation? Why not offer them more compensation so they accept it with grace? He listened. Then he looked out of the window at the endless line of petitioners waiting in the corridor, men with sun-cracked faces who had traveled for days, barefoot, to beg the new government for a scrap of justice. Grace, he thought, is a luxury of those who have never known hunger. When the UP Zamindari Abolition Act finally passed in 1950, it did not magically turn all tenants into comfortable farmers. Implementation was messy, uneven, and often sabotaged. But in village after village, a quiet miracle began to unfold. Men who had bowed all their lives were handed pattas, title deeds, with their own names written on them for the first time. One old farmer, his hands trembling, traced the letters slowly and asked, "This means this land is mine?" When the officer nodded, the man bent down, scooped a handful of mud, and pressed it to his forehead as if it were holy ash. For Charan Singh, that was the true moment of independence. Not the flag at Red Fort, the thumbprint on a land deed in a forgotten village. Success, however, brought its own crisis. With zamindari formally abolished, many in the Congress felt the peasant problem had been solved. It hadn't. New inequalities were emerging. Medium landowners, many from his own Jat and other middle-caste communities, were rising, sometimes as new oppressors, sometimes as a fragile shield against big capital and the state. The Congress High Command in Delhi, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, was increasingly obsessed with heavy industry, dams, big public sector projects, temples of modern India, Nehru called them. Charan Singh looked at the same dams and factories and saw something else. Money, attention, and prestige being sucked towards cities, leaving the villages where 80% of Indians still lived. To survive on crumbs, a new kind of rivalry was born. It wasn't about personal dislike. Nehru was Cambridge-educated, charismatic, adored by urban elites. Charan, rough-spoken, village-rooted, had no love for English phrases or drawing-room debates. It was about two competing visions of India. Would the nation be built from the city outward or from the soil upward? The clash became open in 1959 at a Congress session in Nagpur. The leadership pushed a resolution calling for a socialistic pattern of society, heavy emphasis on state-led industrialization, and, most alarming to Charan, the idea of cooperative farming, where small holdings would be pooled and worked collectively. He heard in that phrase an echo of something he detested, a faint shadow of Soviet-style collectivization, of the peasant losing the one thing his whole life had been spent fighting to gain, his own tiny piece of land. In the packed hall, as delegates cheered and slogans echoed, he felt suffocated. This was the party he had gone to jail for, the party under whose flag he had fought zamindars, the party that now seemed willing to treat the farmer as a unit in an economic plan, not a human being with pride and agency. Back in Uttar Pradesh, when the pressure came to implement these socialistic schemes, he did something that stunned colleagues. He resigned from Nehru's cabinet in the state. He walked away from ministerial power just as his influence was peaking, rather than put his signature on policies he believed would hand the farmer from landlord to bureaucrat. For a career politician, it looked suicidal. For him, it was simple math. No office, he told a close ally, is worth the price of a peasant's freedom. The resignation marked a turning point. Within the Congress, he was now seen as troublesome, unpredictable, too rigid. For the peasantry in western UP, he became something else, a rare leader who would walk out of power rather than compromise on their interests. In the 1960s, as Nehru died and Lal Bahadur Shastri briefly took over, then died too, a new figure began to rise in the Congress firmament. Nehru's daughter, Indira. Many in the party underestimated her, seeing only the soft-spoken Gungi Gudia, the dumb doll, placed in the prime minister's chair by party bosses in 1966. Charan Singh was not impressed by labels. He watched with a practiced lawyer's eye how she slowly turned the tables on the very men who thought they had installed a puppet, appealing directly to the poor, to the youth, to the landless with slogans like Garibi Hatao, remove poverty. To most ears, it was electrifying. To his, it was dangerously familiar. He had heard promises his whole life. What mattered was who wrote the laws, who controlled the police, who set crop prices, who decided whether a farmer's wheat would rot in godowns or reach the market. He saw something else too. As Indira centralized power in Delhi, state leaders who were too independent, especially those with their own mass base, were quietly cut down to size. And in Uttar Pradesh, with its vast rural vote bank, there was one name that still commanded fierce loyalty among peasants: Charan Singh. By 1967, the Congress dominance that had seemed unshakable after independence was beginning to crack. Prices were rising. Food shortages had pushed India to the humiliating ship-to-mouth existence, dependent on American grain. Urban unemployment bred anger. In the countryside, the promises of land reform and prosperity felt thin. In Uttar Pradesh, resentment against the local Congress machine, often seen as arrogant, corrupt, urban-biased, was boiling over. For the first time since 1937, the Congress faced a serious challenge in the state elections. Charan Singh had seen enough from inside to know reform from within was failing. He broke away and joined forces with socialists, caste-based leaders, small parties, anti-Congress independents. It was an unlikely coalition, ideologically messy, numerically fragile, but it had one common fuel: the determination to break Congress' monopoly. They called it the Samyukta Vidayak Dal, the United Legislators Front. Campaigning across western UP, Charan would stand on makeshift stages, often just the back of a tractor, and slice through the confusion with a single line: "For 20 years you gave them your vote. Tell me honestly, Has your life changed more or their bungalows? The crowds would roar back, Anka, theirs. When the votes were counted, history shuddered. In the Uttar Pradesh Assembly, the Congress lost its majority. The unthinkable had happened. In the heartland of Indian politics, the party that had led the freedom movement had been pushed into the corner. Suddenly, MLAs who had spent their careers under the Congress umbrella were holding frantic meetings, clutching calculators instead of manifestos. Who would form the government? In smoky rooms, under slowly turning fans, leaders of the fractured opposition argued, postured, threatened to walk out. Numbers were tight, egos were large, old ideological wounds flared. Some wanted a socialist at the top. Others demanded representation for backward castes, for regional satraps. Through the noise, one fact remained hard to ignore. Among all the contenders, only one man had both administrative experience and a solid, independent base in the countryside, Charan Singh. But if he took the chief minister's chair, he would be walking into a minefield. Congress was still the single largest party. The central government in Delhi, under Indira Gandhi, watched every move in Lucknow with cold interest. Within the coalition, there were leaders who would accept him as CM for now and start plotting his fall the next morning. Still, this was the chance he had spent a lifetime preparing for. A chance not just to pass bills, but to run the largest state in India with the farmer at the center of every file. He accepted. The boy who had once watched his father tremble before a village moneylender took oath as chief minister of Uttar Pradesh in April 1967. From the very first day, the clock began to tick again. He knew this government was a house of cards. Every disgruntled MLA, every whispered offer from the Congress, every ego bruised by a missed portfolio could cause a defection. A handful of men crossing the floor could topple him. It was 1937 and 1950 all over again. Only now the battlefield was much larger, the stakes higher, the enemy more sophisticated. He worked like a man racing an unseen deadline. He ordered inquiries into corruption that had been carefully buried. He pushed for tighter implementation of land ceilings, trying to prevent big landholders from hiding their excess under the names of relatives and servants. He demanded better prices and procurement for wheat and sugarcane, knowing that a few rupees more or less per quintal could decide whether a farmer fell back into debt. Inside the secretariat, officials grumbled. This man, they said, half in awe, half in irritation, reads every file. He would scrawl stinging questions in the margins. Who benefits from this? Is this in favor of the cultivator or the contractor? Explain why delay is justified when the season will not wait. His rival in this act was not yet Indira directly, but the vast entrenched Congress network that still ran deep through the state, in the police, in the bureaucracy, in the minds of legislators who had grown used to looking toward Delhi for blessing. Whispers spread that the central leadership was not amused by this defiant experiment in non-Congress rule. Offers were made in the shadowy vocabulary of politics. If 10 of you break away, we can promise you a ministry and a stable Congress government. Why stick with a coalition that may fall any day? Inside the chief minister's residence at odd hours, Charan would summon small groups of MLAs, look them in the eye, and remind them, you did not defeat Congress to become their tail. You defeated them to prove that power can flow from the Ket, from the field, not from one family's residence in Delhi. Some were moved, some were not. The day the first major defection happened, it felt less like a thunderclap and more like a slow, sickening crack. One MLA crossed, then another, then one more. Each gave a different excuse: local grievances, lack of consultation, ideological concerns. Behind those words, the real story was brutally simple. The old center of gravity was pulling them back. In February 1968, barely 10 months after he had taken office, Charan Singh walked into the assembly to face a vote he knew he might lose. The numbers had slipped. The allies were wavering. Congress, humiliated by its loss, tasted revenge. Newspaper headlines framed it as a simple power game. To him, it was something harder to swallow. He had finally reached the steering wheel of the state, only to find the engine surrounded by hands yanking at every lever. As the debate raged that day, as hostile members smirked and commentators in the gallery whispered about the inevitability of his fall, he sat with his hands clasped, eyes narrowed, listening to every word. He could still cut deals. He could still offer ministries, compromise on investigations, promise favors to those on the fence. he chose not to. When the moment came and it was clear the coalition no longer commanded a majority, he rose and announced his resignation. No horse trading, no desperate midnight bargains. He walked out of the assembly the way he had once walked out of Nehru's cabinet, head high, pockets relatively empty, conscience unforgivingly full. Outside, the Congress celebrated his fall. In Delhi, Indira Gandhi's aides noted with satisfaction that yet another non-Congress experiment had collapsed. The system, they said, is correcting itself. But in villages far from Lucknow's marble corridors, the story sounded different. For many peasants, he had not failed, he had been toppled. Toppled because he had dared to put their interests above those of men with smoother accents and deeper pockets. And for Charan Singh himself, this defeat held a hidden twist. Losing the chief minister's chair did not bury him. It freed him from the last illusions that the Congress machine could be bent toward his vision. From here on, his struggle would not just be against unjust laws or feudal landlords. It would be against a new kind of concentration of power, one that wore khadi, spoke of socialism, and increasingly answered to a single surname. Somewhere in Delhi, as his government fell in Lucknow, Indira Gandhi tightened her grip on the National Party. Their collision course was set. The man of the soil and the woman of the dynasty were now moving, step by step, toward a confrontation that would redefine Indian politics and decide whether the farmer's voice could ever truly stand equal to the call from Delhi. 10 years later, that confrontation would arrive in the strangest possible form. The man who had spent his life fighting Delhi would be asked to rule it. The poorest farmer's son would be sworn in as prime minister of the world's largest democracy, with a secret lethal condition attached. He had just a few weeks to prove he deserved the chair. If he failed, he would not only fall, he would drag an entire government, an entire dream of farmer-led politics down with him. But before that ticking clock began in Delhi, another quieter one had been ticking in the villages. After his government in Uttar Pradesh collapsed in 1968, many expected Charan Singh to fade away, a footnote in the long saga of Congress dominance. He did the opposite. He went back to the only place that had never betrayed him, the countryside. Day after day, jeep bouncing over rutted roads, he would arrive in dusty hats and sugarcane mandis, stand under a neem tree and ask the same question in a low, steady voice. Tell me, since my government fell, have your debts gone down or up? The answers were bitter laughter, raised hands, lists of fresh loans taken for seed, for weddings, for medical emergencies. Out of that anger, he began to build something new. A party not of lawyers sipping tea in Lucknow clubs, but of farmers, middle peasants, small traders, men who smelt of earth and jaggery and diesel. He called it Bharatiya Kranti Dal, the Indian Revolutionary Party. The word revolutionary was not chosen lightly. He was declaring open revolt not only against Congress, but against the entire way Indian politics had come to think about power, from the top down, from Delhi outward. In cramped village schoolrooms by hurricane lamps, he would lecture young activists on tenancy laws, on procurement prices, on how a 1 rupee difference per quintal in sugarcane could mean the difference between a family eating dal or just dry rotis. He turned the farmers' daily misery into a political language. In Delhi, Indira Gandhi was fighting her own war. By 1969, she had broken with the old Congress bosses, split the party, and emerged as the singular, unchallenged face of power. Her image flooded the airwaves. Indira with a plow on her shoulder, Indira standing in paddy fields, Indira promising Garibi Hatao. To city journalists, she was the only man in her cabinet. To Charan Singh, she was something much colder, a leader who had mastered the art of talking in the name of the poor while centralizing every lever of authority in her own hands. And yet politics makes strange bedfellows. In 1970, after her loyalists helped topple the Congress government in Uttar Pradesh, she needed a stable chief minister with rural appeal. The numbers in the assembly pointed in one direction: Charan Singh. The same man who had walked out of Nehru's cabinet. The same man whose government Congress had helped pull down 2 years earlier. Now, with her outside support, he was back as chief minister. Newspapers called it a marriage of convenience. For him, it was more like a temporary ceasefire with a tiger. He accepted because the fields would not wait. Fertilizer prices were rising. Canal water was being diverted to those with connections. Big industrialists were pressuring the state to acquire fertile land for factories and townships. Every month without a government focused on the Kisan was another month of quiet dispossession. He took the oath again in February 1970 with a mental note written in fire. This will not last. Use every day. The experiment exploded within 8 months. As he pushed investigations into corruption, as he resisted pressure to bend land laws in favor of powerful interests, as he ignored Delhi's suggestions on postings and transfers, the relationship with Indira snapped. One autumn evening, word reached Lucknow. The central government had recommended president's rule. His government was dismissed. No floor test, no debate, just a letter. As the news spread, a crowd of farmers gathered spontaneously outside his residence. Men who had traveled overnight from Meerut, Muzaffarnagar, Bagpat. They shouted slogans not just against Congress, but against the idea that a chief minister could be removed so casually by a distant hand in Delhi. In that moment, something shifted. His conflict with Indira was no longer just personal or ideological. To the man in the field, it became a simple story. When our man rules, Delhi removes him. When their man rules, Delhi protects him. So, out of the wreckage of that second fall, Charan Singh began to think on a larger canvas. If the state could be overturned by the center so easily, then the battle had to move to the center itself. By the mid-1970s, the air was crackling with discontent, rising prices, student agitations, strikes. In Bihar, Jayaprakash Narayan, JP, called for total revolution, urging people to fight corruption and authoritarianism. Charan Singh listened to JP's speeches and heard echoes of his own life. The insistence that power must be accountable to the last person in the village, not just to a handful of loyalists in the capital. He merged his party with other regional forces to form Bharatiya Lok Dal, the Indian People's Party, and became one of the pillars of a new, messy, dangerous coalition of anti-Indira forces. For Indira Gandhi, this was crossing a red line. The man who had challenged her father's economic vision was now joining hands with a mass movement that threatened her hold on power. On the night of 25 June 1975, when she declared the emergency, democracy itself was put on a stopwatch. Within hours, opposition leaders across India were arrested. At a small house in western Uttar Pradesh, Charan Singh's family heard a hard knock on the gate. A police officer, visibly uncomfortable, read out the detention order. Under the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, MISE, no trial, no warrant in the old sense, just an order. For years he had told villagers about laws written in English that could snatch away their fields. Now a law was snatching away his freedom. In prison, the man of the soil was caged in stone. At night, the floodlights of the jail yard threw harsh white pools on the ground, attracting swarms of insects. Political prisoners, socialists, RSS workers, trade unionists, leaders from every corner of the anti-Indira spectrum walked in, slow circles talking in low voices. Charan Singh would sit slightly apart, a notebook balanced on his knees, scribbling figures. Even here, locked away, his obsession did not change. "How many crores," he would mutter, "are we spending on steel and cars? And how much on irrigation and village roads?" One younger detainee asked him, half joking, "Panditji, we are in jail. Why are you still doing budgets in your head?" He looked up, eyes tired but sharp. "Because when this ends," he said, "they will say we only knew how to shout slogans. I want them to know some of us also know how to run a government." In that cell, amid the stench of sweat and disinfectant, he began shaping the ideas that would later appear in his books, India. This economic policy, the Gandhian blueprint and others, arguing fiercely that India's path lay not in copying Western industrial models, but in strengthening its millions of small farmers and artisans. The emergency hardened him. It stripped away any remaining belief that good intentions in Delhi could be trusted without strong institutions, independent courts, fearless opposition. He saw up close how easily rights could be suspended, how quickly the police could be turned into an army of fear, and he did not forget who had signed the orders. When Indira finally lifted the emergency in 1977 and called elections, she believed, or was told, that people would be too afraid, too grateful for discipline to vote her out. The voters answered with a thunderclap. In the Hindi heartland, Congress was routed. The prison gates opened. Charan Singh stepped out to find himself no longer just a regional leader, but a national figure, one of the architects of a new alliance called the Janata Party. It was a strange beast. Socialists who hated big business, ex-congressmen who hated Indira, Charan Singh leaders with RSS roots, Gandhians, farmers' leaders, caste-based outfits. They had little in common, except one thing. They had all, in one way or another, been crushed or sidelined by Indira Gandhi. The Janata Party won a staggering mandate. For the first time since independence, India would be governed from Delhi by a non-Congress party. In the battle he had been fighting since 1937 to prove that power did not belong by birthright to one organization, one family, this was a colossal victory. But as he walked into the Parliament building in 1977 as a senior leader of the new ruling party, he felt something else. This, too, was a race against time. The coalition was unstable. The egos were many. The expectations of the people, after the darkness of emergency, were near impossible to meet. If they failed, the country might swing back to the very force they had just defeated. Morarji Desai became Prime Minister. Charan Singh took charge of the Home Ministry, the beating heart of India's internal power. The same ministry that had sent him to jail 2 years earlier was now under the command of the man it had tried to silence. He moved quickly. He ordered the release of remaining political detainees. He pushed for commissions of inquiry into the abuses of emergency, forced sterilizations, police brutalities, censorship. He was determined that history should record, in cold legal language, what had been done in the name of discipline. At the same time, his old focus did not waver. He argued in cabinet that without serious attention to agriculture, minimum support prices, rural credit, irrigation, procurement, the Janata government would be a temporary detour, not a new road. But inside this victory, a fresh rivalry was brewing. This time not with Indira directly, but with his own prime minister. Morarji Desai was a veteran of the freedom struggle, rigid, proud, deeply moral in his own eyes. Charan Singh saw him as too conservative on economic reforms, too soft on the big industrial houses, too unwilling to break fully with the old Congress mindset. Above all, he saw something he considered dangerous: the growing influence of former Charan Singh members within the government who remained tied, in mind and heart, to the RSS. To Charan, who had always feared any concentration of power, whether in one family or one ideological organization, this was unacceptable. He warned repeatedly, "We defeated one over-centralization. Do not replace it with another." The quarrel over dual membership, whether Janata leaders could also remain loyal to the RSS, became the fuse. In 1978, after months of internal sniping, he resigned as Home Minister. Once more, he walked out of high office rather than bend his principles. Once more, his enemies wrote him off as stubborn, impossible. Once more, they underestimated his ability to turn defeat into leverage. Outside Delhi's Lutyens' bungalows, the country was watching with growing impatience. They had voted out a dictatorship only to be given a circus. Infighting, accusations, counter-accusations. In tea stalls from Saharanpur to Satara, people asked the same question. Did we remove Indira, just so these men could fight over chairs? Charan Singh understood the danger. If Janata collapsed in disgrace, Indira's return would be almost guaranteed. And yet he could not accept a government in which, in his view, both the spirit of the anti-emergency struggle and the centrality of the farmer were being diluted. The tension snapped in mid-1979. With Jayaprakash Narayan dead, the moral glue of the coalition was gone. Charan Singh, backed by his Lokdal followers and others, withdrew support from Morarji Desai. The government fell. The same parliament that had once been a fortress of Congress, then a victory arch for Janata, now became an arena of raw calculation. Who would step into the vacuum? In the maze of corridors, emissaries scurried. One name kept coming up in conversations that made old congressmen smile and Janata veterans frown: Charan Singh. For the first time, the possibility stood naked. The peasant leader from Nurpur, the man twice toppled in Uttar Pradesh, the prisoner of the emergency, could become prime minister. But the numbers were cruel. Janata was fractured. Lokdal did not have enough seats. To form a government, he needed outside support. From whom? From the very person whose emergency he had suffered. From the woman he blamed for turning democracy into a personal instrument. Indira Gandhi. It was the ultimate twist of Indian politics. The tiger he had spent a decade fighting was now offering him a ride, on conditions written in invisible ink. Congress, now in opposition, indicated that if Charan Singh was chosen as prime minister, they would support him from outside to keep Jana Sangh elements out of power and to punish his rivals inside Janata. He faced the hardest calculation of his life. If he refused, he would leave the field open to others, including perhaps a regrouped Congress itself. If he accepted, he could finally try to run the union government with the cultivator at its core, redirect budgets, strengthen cooperatives, rework credit, reverse the tilt toward big business. But he would do so under the shadow of a woman who had already shown the world how she dealt with people who outlived their usefulness. He said yes. On 28th of July 1979 in Rashtrapati Bhavan's Ashoka Hall, beneath crystal chandeliers and painted ceilings, Charan Singh took the oath. As Prime Minister of India, the son of a small peasant who had once weighed every rupee of land tax his father paid, now controlled a budget of thousands of crores. Cameras flashed. Commentators called it a triumph of democracy, a victory of the village over the city. But hidden in the ceremony was a fuse. Under the Constitution, a new prime minister who did not come in with a clear majority had to prove his strength on the floor of the Lok Sabha within a set time. The president announced the date. He had just a few weeks to assemble numbers, hold his allies, and survive a no-confidence motion. Outside, Indira Gandhi waited. She had, with one letter of support, made him prime minister. With one letter of withdrawal, she could destroy him and the fragile credibility of the non-Congress alternative along with him. For Charan Singh, every day in office now was a race against two clocks. One was visible, the calendar counting down to the trust vote. The other was internal, the question of how much he could do, how many files he could sign, how many policies he could redirect towards the farmer before the rug was pulled. He worked with frantic intensity. He held meeting after meeting with economists, bureaucrats, state leaders. He spoke of redirecting incentives towards small-scale industry and agriculture, of checking the stranglehold of big business groups, of strengthening rural credit structures that had been promised reform for decades and rarely received it. At night, the lights in the Prime Minister's office burned past midnight. In the corridors, some officials whispered, "This man behaves as if he has months. Does he not see he might have only days?" He saw it. That was precisely why he worked the way he did. He knew what it meant to have power snatched away mid-stride. He had lived it in Lucknow twice. Now the stakes were not one state, but a nation of hundreds of millions. As the day of the confidence vote approached, the pressure on each MP in the Lok Sabha reached fever pitch. Offers, threats, promises of future tickets, warnings of political oblivion. Congress watched from the sidelines, counting heads, measuring mood, studying the polls. Then, at the last possible moment, with the television crews ready and the security tightened for a dramatic vote, the twist landed. Indira Gandhi announced that Congress was withdrawing support. No clear reason. No new policy disagreement that had suddenly emerged in those few weeks. Just a blunt political calculation. If Charan Singh survived and stabilized his government, he might consolidate a rural base that could challenge Congress for a generation. Better to end the experiment now, even if it meant subjecting the country to yet another election. On 20th of August 1979, before he could even face the Lok Sabha for the trust vote, Charan Singh went to Rashtrapati Bhavan and submitted his resignation. The man who had reached the highest office in the land lasted just 23 days as a functioning prime minister. To some it was a joke, to others a tragedy. To him it was a familiar pattern, played now on the grandest possible stage. Twice in Uttar Pradesh, now once in Delhi, he had tried to remake power from the perspective of the last man in the line. Thrice larger forces, landlord lobbies, party machines, central high commands, had combined to pull him down before he could fully test his ideas. Yet, even in that moment of humiliation, another story was being written. In villages across western Uttar Pradesh, in farmer households from Haryana to Bihar, people did not just see a failed prime minister. They saw a man who had reached the top without pedigree, without palace, without English polish, and been shoved off because he refused to be anyone's puppet. They saw how a single signature of withdrawal from Delhi could still decide the fate of a leader they trusted. And somewhere in the echo of that betrayal, a new kind of political identity, Kisan power, independent of Congress, suspicious of any family claim to permanent rule, hardened. Charan Singh remained in office as caretaker prime minister until the next election. He sat at the same desk, in the same room, now with almost no illusion left about the generosity of his rivals. Outside, Indira Gandhi was already preparing her comeback. Inside, the man from Nurpur, older now, hair thinning, back stiff from decades of sitting on Sharpei and in jeeps, looked once more at the maps of India's districts, at the tables of crop yields, at the skewed graphs of investment. His time at the very top had been brutally short, but his fight, for the farmer to count as much as the industrialist, for the village to speak as loudly as Delhi, was far from over. Imagine this. 23 days ago, your signature could move armies, topple bureaucrats, redraw budgets worth thousands of crores. Now you are sitting on a sagging Sharpei in a mud-walled courtyard, a lantern buzzing with mosquitoes above your head, while a farmer waves a crumpled electricity bill in your face and growls, "You became prime minister, and still they did this to us?" That was how Charan Singh's life after power began, not with a graceful retirement, with a fall so brutal that even his enemies felt a flicker of unease, and with a new cruel deadline. One last election cycle to lessen now, save the idea he had fought for all his life, before age, illness, and an unforgiving rival wiped it off the map. When elections were announced in early 1980, the air felt strangely familiar. Slogans on walls, trucks with loudspeakers, posters of faces that had already become part of India's political wallpaper. But the mood was different. In rally after rally, Indira Gandhi stepped back into the spotlight she had lost in 1977, older, wounded by defeat, but radiating the same steely confidence. Her message was simple and lethal. Look what happened when you trusted these people. 2 years of fighting, quarreling, changing prime ministers like seasons. Give the country a stable hand again. She did not have to name Charan Singh. His 23 days in office had become a punchline in drawing rooms, a cautionary tale in editorial columns, a whispered warning in village tea stalls. Vote for them, Congress workers would say, and you'll get another government that falls before the ink is dry. For Charan Singh, every campaign stop was a double burden. He had to defend not just his brief prime ministership, but the very possibility of a non-Congress India. Standing on rickety wooden stages in small towns, he would grip the microphone with his farmer's hands, thick fingers, nails chipped, and fire back. They toppled my government before I could even face a vote. Is that your failure or their fear? He reminded crowds of the emergency, of forced sterilizations, of journalists jailed, of courts bent. The same hand, he would say, voice tightening, that signed my detention order has now signed the letter that pulled down your government. But rhetoric could not erase the spectacle of chaos that the Janata years had become. When the votes were counted, the verdict was ruthless. Congress swept back to power. Indira Gandhi returned as prime minister. The non-Congress experiment lay in pieces. Yet in the wreckage, one small stubborn fact stood out. In Bagpat, the dusty constituency of sugarcane fields and tube wells that had become his political home, Charan Singh won. Badly bruised, heavily outnumbered in parliament, mocked as a failed prime minister, but not abandoned by the people whose lives had always been his compass. For them, he was still Hamara Admi, our man. Back in the opposition benches of the Lok Sabha, he faced a harsher clock than the one that had ticked in Rashtrapati Bhavan. He was nearly 80. The limp in his walk was more pronounced. Long speeches left him exhausted, breath catching slightly at the end of each sentence. He knew he did not have decades. He might not even have one more full election cycle. If the idea of independent Kisan power, farmers as a political force not chained to Congress, was to outlive him, it had to be built now. So, while others sulked or settled into the comforts of opposition, he went back to the only battle he truly trusted, the one in the fields. He restructured his organization into a sharper, more focused Lokdal. No more vague all things to all people slogans. He wanted one identity, carved so deeply that even a child in a village school would know it. If they say Congress, he told his aides, let them think of the city, of Delhi, of big men in big cars. If they say Lokdal, they must think of the Kisan. The rivalry with Indira shifted from parliament to a larger stage. She held cabinet meetings about 5-year plans and heavy industry. He held Kisan panchayats about sugarcane prices and fertilizer subsidies. She stood on red-carpeted platforms at Vigyan Bhavan. He stood on tractor trolleys in fields where the earth still smelt of fresh plowing. One day on Delhi's boat club lawns, that long stretch of green facing India Gate where power likes to parade itself, he turned the capital into a village. They came by the tens of thousands. Farmers from western Uttar Pradesh, Haryana, Rajasthan, Punjab. Turbans in every color, shirts stiff with dried sweat, cracked heels thrust into worn-out slippers. The avenues of Lutyens Delhi, built for imperial processions and state ceremonies, were choked with bullock carts and trucks carrying bundles of sugarcane as political banners. From the stage, you could barely see the end of the crowd. It looked like a human river that had finally found the sea. Charan Singh walked slowly to the microphone. For a moment, he said nothing, just looked at the men who had left their fields in harvest season, at the women who had traveled all night, children asleep on their laps, at the policemen uneasily fingering their lathis, unused to facing an army of plowmen instead of students or factory workers. When he spoke, his voice was hoarser than in his younger days, but the cadence was the same, the arguments as sharp. "They tell you," he said, "that India shines because of big factories, big dams, big projects. I ask you, who feeds the workers in those factories? Who grows the food for the men who build those dams?" He raised a hand, fingers spread. "5 fingers," he said. "The factory is only one. The other 4 are you." The crowd roared. Some wept openly. Delhi, the city that had twice thrown him out of power, was hearing in its own heart a sound it could not easily ignore. The farmer, stepping onto the national stage as a conscious political class, not just a backdrop in government propaganda. Indira Gandhi watched these developments with cold clarity. She knew the danger. A united Kisan vote in the Hindi belt could, in theory, do what no urban-based opposition had managed: permanently fracture Congress's dominance. And there was another twist. Charan Singh was no longer alone in speaking the language of the fields. Others, in Haryana, in parts of Rajasthan and Bihar, were beginning to rise. Chaudhary Devilal, Karpuri Thakur. Young men influenced by socialist thought and by Charan Singh's own writings were forming their own farmer fronts. To some, it looked like a victory for his ideas. To him, it also looked like a warning. Fragmentation, he told an aide one evening as they drove past wheat glowing in the setting sun, is the disease of Indian politics. If farmer parties also fragment, we will become bargaining chips, not a force. He had to hold his flock together. He had to bind the emerging leaders and his own legacy into a single rope strong enough to tug at Delhi, and he had to do it fast, before time took the decision out of his hands. The 1980s began to turn darker. Riots flickered across the map. Communal cracks widened. Economic stress returned as inflation nibbled at wages and the price of urea crept upward. In 1982, as a massive agitation of government employees and transport workers rocked the capital, farmers in the outskirts whispered, "If they stop Delhi, maybe someone will finally listen to us too." Charan Singh traveled more, not less. Doctors warned him to slow down. He ignored them. He joked bitterly, "If I sit at home, they will say I am finished. If I die on the road, at least they will know I was still walking." In October 1984, the country's fault lines exploded. After months of tension in Punjab, Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards. For a few days, India stopped breathing. Then in Delhi and other cities, something even more terrible happened. Sikhs were hunted, houses burned, men dragged from homes and killed. Trains of refugees arrived at small stations, eyes hollow. Charan Singh, the old critic of centralized power, watched in horror as reports came in of police standing by, of mobs acting with impunity. In Parliament and in public, he demanded accountability. "What is a government," he asked in a choked voice, "that cannot protect its own citizens from organized murder?" His words were nearly drowned out by a tidal wave of emotion. Rajiv Gandhi, young, fresh-faced, suddenly thrust into the prime minister's chair, swept the 1984 election with a mandate even his mother had never commanded. In that landslide, Charan Singh won again in Bagpat, proof that, in his pocket of the Hindi belt, the bond with the farmer held. But nationally, his space shrank. The Congress return was near total. For the third time in his life, he saw the same pattern. When Delhi felt threatened, when the old order trembled, it could swing back with crushing force, burying not just governments, but possibilities. This time, however, his enemy was not only political, it was biological. The first stroke came quietly. One winter morning in the mid-1980s, as he worked through a pile of papers, constituency requests, party memos, drafts of articles, on rural credit. His right hand suddenly refused to obey. The pen slipped. The letters on the page dissolved into a gray blur. Aid rushed in. There were frantic phone calls, hurried consultations, whispered diagnoses. The man whose mind had sliced through complex land laws and budget documents for half a century now struggled to form words without effort. He would sit, eyes clear but body stiff, listening intently while others spoke, then marshal his strength and say, in a few compressed sentences, what earlier would have been a half-hour argument. The clock had changed again. Politics is merciless to age and illness. The very leaders who had once jostled for a seat near him now began to meet in other rooms to float other names. Devi Lal in Haryana, emerging OBC leaders in Uttar Pradesh, new coalitions, new slogans. In this shifting landscape, one figure began to step forward to carry his particular legacy. His son, Ajit Singh. Western-educated with a degree in engineering and a stint in the United States, Ajit Singh was in many ways the opposite of his father. Comfortable in English, at ease with computers and modern management jargon, to some old-timers this felt like a betrayal of the earthy, dhoti-clad image of Kisan politics. To Charan Singh it was a necessity. Times change, he said quietly to a colleague who questioned Ajit's prominence. The land is the same, the crops are the same, the exploitation is the same. Let the style change, not the side. In 1984, in the last election he would fight under his own full strength. He ensured Ajit's deeper entry into politics, a bloodline step, yes, but in his mind, also a bridge. From the age of handwritten ledgers to the age of computers, from the generation that remembered colonial landlords to the one that would battle corporate capture. Even as his body weakened, his instinct for structure did not. He pushed for alliances, mergers, new combinations that would keep the Kisan voice audible. In 1984, his Lokdal joined hands with other outfits to form the Dalit Mazdoor Kisan Party, an ambitious attempt to unite farmers, laborers, and the oppressed castes in a single front. It did not last. The old curse returned. Egos, local rivalries, ideological splits. But in those attempts, in those messy experiments, something was leaking into the soil of North Indian politics. The idea that caste, on class and region, could be organized not just as vote banks for Congress, but as independent bargaining powers, with the farmer often at the center. By 1986, he rarely traveled. The rallies still happened, flags waving, slogans invoking his name, but he watched them now on television, a box he set in a room that smelled of antiseptic and old paper. Sometimes a camera would linger on a placard. Kisanon ka neta Charan Singh Zindabad. Long live Charan Singh, leader of the farmers. He would give a small, almost embarrassed smile. My life, he once told a visiting journalist, is less important than whether they remember why they are shouting. On winter evenings, when the pain in his limbs was less, he would ask his assistants to read aloud from newspapers reports of new fertilizer price hikes, of fresh loans taken by smallholders, of protests by sugarcane growers against delayed payments from mills. After decades, the headlines had barely changed. One night, listening to yet another story of farmers blocking roads in anger, he interrupted, voice thin but urgent. "Write this down," he said. "It is not enough to shout for higher prices. We must build systems where the farmer is not always standing with a begging bowl before the trader, the banker, the politician." Even as his own system shut down, he was still drafting blueprints in his mind. On 29th of May 1987 in New Delhi, the clock that had been ticking since a boy from Nurpur first opened a land revenue manual in his teens finally stopped. Charan Singh died at 84. Newsreaders on Doordarshan, dressed in white, adopted solemn tones. Leaders from every party issued tributes. Champion of the peasantry, true son of the soil, incorruptible fighter for the rural poor. But in the places that mattered most to him, the grief was less scripted. In villages across western Uttar Pradesh and Haryana, fields fell silent for a few hours. Men who had once walked miles to hear him under a neem tree stood bareheaded in the sun, listening to crackling transistor radios. Some cried openly. Others simply clenched their jaws and stared at the earth. In one village near Meerut, an old farmer said to no one in particular, "They killed his governments 3 times. At least they could not kill his name." He was buried in Ghaziabad district, on land that would become known as Kisan Ghat, Farmers' Memorial, Not far from the samadhis of the towering nationalist icons of Delhi, the man who had spent his life arguing that the village mattered, as much as the capital finally took his place in its sacred geography, death did not end his conflict with Delhi. It shifted it. In the years that followed, every time a government tried to push through a policy that hurt farmers, a sudden cut in procurement, an attempt to acquire fertile land without fair compensation, his ghost seemed to rise. Leaders would invoke him, sometimes sincerely, sometimes as a shield. Would Charan Singh have allowed this? They would ask. In western Uttar Pradesh, his political DNA shaped an entire generation. Ajit Singh formed his own outfit, the Rashtriya Lok Dal, explicitly claiming his father's mantle as voice of the cultivator. Coalitions rose and fell, with BJP, with Congress, with Third Front experiments, but the core remained. Bagpat, Muzaffarnagar, the sugarcane belt, voting in patterns that reflected a distinct Kisan consciousness. At the national level, his ideas flowed into unexpected channels. The rise of caste-based parties in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, parties of Yadavs, of Dalits, of backward classes, often drew, knowingly, or not, from the template he had helped sketch, that those at the bottom of the rural hierarchy could organize as autonomous centers of power, not permanent junior partners. His economic arguments, against blind imitation of Western industrial models, for strengthening small-scale agriculture and village industries, were dismissed by some as old-fashioned during the liberalization wave of the 1990s. Yet every time a crisis hit, a drought, a spike in farmer suicides, a wave of rural distress, policymakers would rediscover in think tank language what he had shouted in plain Hindi. No country can call itself strong if the hands that feed it are weak. On 23rd of December each year, his birthday, the Indian state made a quiet admission of his importance. What had once been just another date on the calendar became officially Kisan Diwa's National Farmers' Day. School children in cities learned his name in textbooks. Government advertisements put his photograph next to smiling cultivators and promised new schemes. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, as massive farmer protests ringed Delhi, tractors parked nose-to-nose on highways, tents sprouting on cold pavements, langurs serving hot meals under foggy skies, his portrait appeared again, on banners, on stickered water tanks, on stages where speakers, hoarse with cold and passion, invoked an older struggle. "This is the fight of Charan Singh's time," one elderly farmer shouted into a microphone at the Singhu border. They did not listen then. They must listen now. Even those who did not know every detail of his biography understood the image. A man in a white dhoti kurta, cap pushed slightly back, eyes grave, jaw set, a shorthand for stubborn, principled rural resistance. More than 3 decades after his death, the state that had toppled his governments 3 times offered a gesture he would have regarded with equal parts irony and satisfaction. In 2024, the government of India announced that Charan Singh would receive the Bharat Ratna, the nation's highest civilian honor. The same Delhi whose concentration of power he had fought all his life was now, finally, officially admitting that the farmers' leader belonged in the first rank of its heroes. For some, it was merely a medal, a plaque, a line in history books. For others, especially in the belt of earth that had given him his first battles, it felt like something deeper, an acknowledgement that the story of India was not only the story of prime ministers who ruled for years, of dynasties that passed power from parent to child, or of tycoons who built empires of concrete and steel. It was also the story of a man who became prime minister for 23 days, who fell again and again rather than bend, who returned every time to the same starting point: a field, a farmer, a question about a loan, a price, a land title. In that sense, the real clock that had been ticking in his life did not stop in 1987. It did not stop in the 1990s or the 2000s or with any change of government. It is still ticking. In every debate over minimum support prices, over land acquisition laws, over whether highways and factories will be built by trampling or by talking, each time India chooses whether to listen to the man on the tractor as much as to the man in the boardroom, it is walking once more into the arena where Charan Singh spent his life. And in that arena, the rivalry he lived and died for still burns, not just between him and one prime minister, one family, one party, but between 2 ideas of the country itself, An India where power flows from the top down, from Delhi outward, or an India where, as an old farmer leader from Nagpur insisted until his last breath, history finally learns to grow from the soil up.